So hello and welcome. My name is Lindsay Whitfield. I'm a professor at Copenhagen Business School, and welcome to the debate seminar series, What is a Just Green Transition? Where we debate that question mark, and I think today will be even more exciting. If we want a revolution, is a revolution just? So there are a lot of interesting topics that will be raised. This is a hybrid seminar series, so I want to say hi to all the participants online. The seminar series is a co-organized event by the Center for Business and Development Studies here at Copenhagen Business School and the Democracy Institute at the Central European University. It's also funded by the Open Society Foundation, so we're very happy for that. Today is the fourth in a series of 5, and I'm very, very happy to have with us today Andreas Malm. So this seminar is called In Conversation with Andreas Malm on his latest book, The Long Heat, Climate Politics When It's Too Late, which he also co-authored with Wim Carton. Andreas wouldn't like it if I give a very long, formal introduction. He has also written so many books that if I were to list them all, it would take us more than 5 minutes. But I do want to say that probably one of his most famous and also very interesting books, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, was made into a feature film. I think most of us academics can't say that about our work. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing Andreas talk about his book and then to have a panel discussion. So the way that the seminar will be structured is a little bit different from the previous seminars because it is a book. We didn't want to sit here and have a discussion amongst the 4 of us who have read the book, and maybe you haven't, and then you wouldn't be in the know. So I've asked Andreas to spend about 20 minutes to give an introduction to the book. Of course, you can't do justice to this book in 20 minutes, but he's going to try to raise what he thinks are some of the important and interesting issues. And then we will turn the camera to the panel, and I've invited some amazing of my colleagues here to discuss the book, and I'll introduce them when we get to that session. And we'll have about 45 minutes of what I hope is an interesting and intense conversation, and then of course there will be 30 to 40 minutes for questions and answers, and hopefully more like discussion with the audience, both here in person and online. So please, those who are online, remember to put your questions and your comments into the chat box, and they will be read. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Andreas.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you for organizing this. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to everyone for coming on a sunny day like this. So I'm just going to lay out broadly what this book is about. And first I have to say that, so like Lindsay said, it's written together with my colleague Wim Carton, who is currently in Colombia for the conference on phasing out fossil fuels. We might maybe return to that issue a little bit later. We started working on this project a few years back, and we wrote one book called Overshoot, How the World Surrendered to Climate Breakdown, which came out in late 2024. And in that book, we try to get our heads around these developments we're seeing where limitations to global warming that have been concentrated in international climate diplomacy, notably the Paris Agreement, are being crossed and transgressed. So we are moving rapidly beyond 1.5 degrees towards 2 degrees as well, these exact targets that we were supposed to keep according to the Paris Agreement. And in Overshoot, we try to analyze the notion, the idea that you can actually do this. You can go beyond these limits and then return to them. This is the notion of overshoot and return that was actually at the heart of much of the original conceptualization of these limits in the Paris Agreement. So the idea that the best way to keep 1.5 degrees as the limit for global warming is actually first to miss it, to go beyond it, because we can't avoid emitting the CO2 that is in the pipeline, literally and figuratively. So we will have to let temperatures rise above 1.5, and then towards the end of the 21st century, we will roll out these massive technologies for sucking the excess CO2 in the atmosphere back to Earth, and we can then return to 1.5 degrees. Or similarly with 2, or any other potentially limit that you set. And in Overshoot, we analyze how this idea emerged and developed and evolved, and its deeper material roots, which are, of course, the drivers in the capitalist economy to keep investing in fossil fuels, notably because they're so much more profitable than renewables. So there is this continuously operating drive in the deep structure of this capitalist economy to extract all the fossil fuels and put them on fire, because that's how you can maximize profits out of these resources. And then mitigation, the original idea that we're going to deal with the climate problem by actually closing down the drivers of it, becomes almost obsolete, because we have failed in actually closing down the drivers. They are continuing to push us into an ever hotter future. And there's very little sign of any kind of deliberate intervention in this process. In fact, I think what we've seen over the past, well, during this decade, is a constant decline of the ambition to mitigate climate change. It's almost like the death of climate politics in a sense. It can induce quite a lot of despair if you've been committed to radical climate politics for a long time. The general feeling right now is extremely different from what it was, say, 7 years ago, 6 years ago, just before the pandemic broke out, when we had the wave of climate mobilization cresting, and then just completely coming to an end with the outbreak of the pandemic. Then the climate movement in Europe tried to regain some momentum towards the end of the pandemic, but right now it barely exists as a movement, with very few exceptions. Fridays for Future is a totally spent force. Extinction Rebellion, I would say as well. Its various offshoots ended up in various dead ends. The climate camp movement is a shadow of itself, although they're trying to do an Endegelände in late May. Let's see what happens. We could go into this in more detail, but generally the climate issue has dropped like a stone on the political agenda, completely overshadowed by first the pandemic and then the various wars that are dominating our time. So first the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 that turned everything in a particular direction of increased geopolitical tension, and then the genocide in Palestine, and now the war in Iran, completely overshadowing climate politics. But this is a guarantee that the catastrophe will blow up in our faces. Particularly, exactly the passivity, the paralysis, the resignation to victorious business as usual ascertains a future of exploding climate catastrophe. And right now we're just months away from an El Nino. Some of you might have seen this. So there is this broad expectation that we will get an intense pulse of climate chaos striking across the world in the next few months. And perhaps, some expect this. This might lead to the climate issue returning to the agenda. But then the question is, what do we do when, in a sense, it is too late? When we have these climate disasters about to go off. Another one that's had a little buzz recently is the potential collapse of the AMOC. We don't know exactly what will happen, but we know that there will be climate disasters striking with greater intensity. And then the question is, what do we do then? And this is what we're trying to grapple with in the second book, The Long Heat, Climate Politics When It's Too Late. Which begins with the argument that, okay, if you can't mitigate the climate crisis, or you don't want to do it for some reason or another, there are basically three things that you can do. First is adaptation, which is trying to live as well as possible with the impacts and try to adapt to them and cope with what's coming. The second thing that you can do is carbon dioxide removal. So, like I said, this idea that, okay, there is too much CO2 in the atmosphere that we've prevented We've failed to prevent the emission of the CO2, but we can perhaps draw the CO2 back to Earth by various kinds of technologies. That's the second thing you can do. And the third thing is solar geoengineering. Some kind of technology for intercepting incoming sunlight and thereby cooling the Earth, or at least capping the warming. So the book is divided into 3 parts where we look into these 3 things, but it's a very uneven structure. So the part on adaptation is very brief. The argument in short is that we now, because it is too late, will indeed have to adapt. This is what people around the world are doing every day. This is life in the warming era, that you have to try to cope with the various impacts that you experience in your life. Obviously, this experience is extremely uneven. Many of us maybe probably don't have to struggle with these impacts on a daily basis because we live in a privileged bubble in the global north, or the imperialist core, or whatever you want to call it. In the global south, in the peripheries of the imperialist system, experiences can be very intense for people where their lives are being wrecked in one way or another by the impacts of climate change. Now, one argument that we make in this part is that there seems to be, at the present moment, a reflexive reaction when disasters strike from policymakers and others, saying that we can cope with this if we roll out one technology or another for getting these things under control. So, for instance, when there are very bad wildfires and extreme heat in France in the summer, which there nowadays almost always is, you have President Macron, for instance, saying that, well, the way to deal with this is to buy more water bombers. So airplanes that can bomb the wildfires with water. We need more effective technologies for doing this. Or last summer you had Rassemblement National, soon probably running the country, arguing that the way to deal with these extreme heat waves is to cover the country in air conditioning technologies, like all over. It has to be like, you know, ubiquitous, omnipresent, everywhere. And we argue that this is a kind of a muscular adaptationism, the idea that if we can only bring out a powerful enough technology, we can get these symptoms under control. And we say that this is never going to work in the end, because no matter how many water bombers you equip yourself with, if temperatures keep rising 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees, there's no way that you're going to be able to bomb these wildfires out of existence. And this applies to any other kind of technology as well. I'm going very quickly now because I don't have a lot of time. So I'll leave the adaptation part there. And it's basically just a setup for the second and the third part. The second part is by far the longest, and it's about the carbon dioxide removal, or CDR. All of these things get abbreviations, acronyms. And this feels already quite obsolete, just like mitigation does, because it's, you know, in the era of Trump, the second presidency, carbon dioxide removal is about as far from the political agenda as climate mitigation is. You might have seen recently that Microsoft has pulled back from all its high-flown aspirations in this regard, which is dealing a major blow to this whole field, because Microsoft was the one consumer of CDR projects and carbon credits floating around in this market. It was basically a market with one big consumer, who is now saying that it's no longer interested in this, which is, you know, just one more example of this general withdrawal from climate ambitions that you've seen in businesses since 2020. But still, the question will come back to haunt us, because precisely the fact that CO2 keeps being poured out into the atmosphere, and emissions not only continue but actually keep rising around the world, means that if we want to get the climate crisis under control at some point, we actually do need to drain the atmosphere of CO2 and get it back to Earth. So we are condemned to a future where this will have to be in one way or another, discussed and executed. So we go into some details, trying to understand what technologies are on offer, what promises they have, and what pitfalls, what adverse side effects they might have, and also try to analyze how they operate in the actually existing capitalist world economy, which is that most of these technologies, insofar as they exist at all, largely they're just fictional. They're imaginative exercises that have a particular ideological function in perpetuating business as usual, because you can always say, well, further down the road we'll have this miraculous technology that's going to save us. This is how particularly bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, or BECCS, has worked. But again, I don't have the time to go into the details, but the technologies that do exist are mostly geared towards perpetuating fossil capital. And the perhaps most egregious example of this is direct air capture, where most of the capacity that exists in the world today for directly capturing CO2 from ambient air, so straight out of the atmosphere, and then you have a pure stream of CO2. Most of this technology is used for enhanced oil recovery, which means that you have companies pulling CO2 out of the air and then injecting it into old oil fields to increase the pressure on the remaining oil and push it up to the surface so you can extract more oil out of the ground. This is what most DAC capacity on Earth today is used for. And that's just one example of how these technologies that were supposed to draw down CO2 actually operate the other way around to further bolster business as usual and get us to emit even more CO2 into the atmosphere. Then, last but not least, we look into solar geoengineering, and I think it's safe to say that in the current moment, carbon dioxide removal is losing its importance, and adaptation and geoengineering are coming to the fore. So the division in the book is perhaps not the one that corresponds to the actual significance of these, the distribution of the significance within these three fields. And there is this expectation now, for instance, Bill McKibben, a very prominent climate activist and intellectual since many years, wrote a few weeks ago that with this El Nino that's coming, I predict this jump in the interest in geoengineering to come. Because geoengineering is the only technology that has the potential for immediately limiting a temperature rise. If you do mitigation, or if you do carbon dioxide removal successfully, it will take many years or even decades for there to be a noticeable relief in the warming. But geoengineering potentially can produce this relief virtually overnight, so from 1 month to another. And what you would do is you would fill planes with aerosols, soot, and shoot these planes high up in the stratosphere and inject the soot and create a kind of an umbrella or screen or shield of soot around the Earth that would block some of the incoming sunlight. And depending on the doses that you shoot out, you can then stop the warming, or you can potentially even reverse it and reduce temperatures. And we are now very rapidly moving towards a maturation of this technology, because we have startup companies and others now performing outdoor experiments. And the leading startup in this field, as you might know, is Stardust Solutions, which is an Israeli-American company. So in this age of genocide in Palestine and American Zionist aggression on Iran, we also have an American-Israeli company that is preparing to offer policymakers, which in this case, in practice, means the American state, the capacity to block incoming sunlight. And they say that they will have a ready technology ready for deployment by 2030. If that's actually going to happen, we don't know, but they're already lobbying US Congress and gearing up for the moment when panic erupts among policymakers, and they are starting to look around. What can we do to get things under control? And then Stardust Solutions can say, well, here we have a patented way for sending out airplanes into the stratosphere and shoot out the aerosols. And a lot of problems will come from this technology. But I don't have the time to go into that. I think I stop there and we can have a discussion. Yeah.
Thank you. So, as we adjust the camera to the panel, let me briefly introduce the panelists today. So, have my colleagues Stefano Ponte, professor at Copenhagen Business School, and Isabel Flores, also from Copenhagen Business School. I will just give a brief introduction because it'll be a bit different this time. They will ask their correct questions directly, but there were so many questions because the book is so interesting. So I tried to kind of organize them a little bit to give us some kind of structure to this discussion. So what we will look at in the first set is this idea, can tech capitalism save the day? So we'll go a little bit more, I think the questions are a little bit different between Stefano and Isabel, but a little bit more into why is that we are turning to these kind of solutions? What is driving it? How can we make sense of these things that make no sense? A lot, if you read the book, I mean, some of this stuff, you can't make it up. It's crazy. And then that people think that these are real solutions and that they raise lots and lots of venture capital money. And we could have done something else with that money, right? So there's a lot of questions there, but we'll just see how many we can get in until I move us to the next set. And then we'll look at this idea that carbon removal from the air and geoengineering cannot save us. We have to stop using fossil fuels. So we will debate a little bit about that and how does that happen? How can that happen? Or what are some of the challenges? And in the third set go more clearly to that question, Lenin's question, what is to be done? How do we destroy fossil capital if we don't see any way that it's going to stop itself? And as I think you said, Andreas, I mean, we thought we only needed one revolution, now we need two. We have to first stop fossil capital, which we haven't succeeded to do yet, and then we have to do removal. So it's like a double revolution. So that's the opening, and we will start with tech capitalism to save the day, question mark, exclamation mark, question mark. And I will let Stefano ask the first question.
Thank you very much. First of all, read the book. Whether you agree with him or not, read the book. It grabs you by the throat and doesn't let you go. There are so many aspects to it. It's a really fantastic read. The most important question I have for you, how did you get Sally Rooney to endorse the book?
You want me to answer that?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, well, we've been in touch for a while, so it wasn't that difficult.
Okay, well, then you tell me how I can do it for my book. Sorry. No, come on. So the book is a great deconstruction of the many tech capitalist approaches to adaptation, carbon capture, and geoengineering. It really unpacks all the bullshit that is behind that, all the hype, all the these kind of dreams that are being put out that we can fix things with yet one more technology. But even for a sympathetic reader like me, it just left me a little bit with a sense of helplessness. Given the fact that the mitigation part is now completely blocked. And I'm not talking just about the UNCCC. With a colleague here in the room, we followed the IMO decarbonization process, and we were almost there to see the first global decarbonization agreement that was then derailed by the US at the last minute. So that sense of helplessness actually led me to think unconsciously or consciously that maybe, geoengineering really is the only option we have. Mm-hmm. And this is coming from like a really deep, before I get to rationalize, that's like, okay, that's the only way we can push it back. So now, maybe that could be done collectively, globally, with, from the bottom up. Maybe it can be controlled better. Maybe it can be done in exchange with a deep devaluation of fossil fuel assets, what Jessica Green is calling in the institutional politics book, not in relation to geoengineering, but more generally. So you also raised the specter of possible climate fascist politics or fascist climate politics. given that we may be going to an inflection point where the sense of urgency will bring those politics back, given the fact that we have fascist politics in many places already, that would be an easy thing to understand how that could happen. Now, my question is, even if we go to the inflection point where your kind of Leninist-inspired revolution takes place, how do we then make sure that there is no drift that is authoritarian or Stalinist in that revolution from happening? Small question.
Thank you. Do I answer now? Okay. Yeah, I think there are two questions in this question. The one, the first is about geoengineering. Is it the only option we have, and can it be done in a good way? Well, first of all, I share your sense of pessimism, obviously. The question is, what do you do with that pessimism? Do you jump on the geoengineering bandwagon and accept that this is what we can do? I'm very hesitant to do so, because I think that it is a technology pregnant with new disasters. And I have to say that you know, I've been kind of engaging with the issue of geoengineering for a few years, and my skepticism about it has only grown. So at a certain point, a few years back, I had some of these ideas too, that perhaps we can actually pull off geoengineering in some kind of progressive, emancipatory, bottom-up, you know, broadly benevolent way. But the more I've read about it, the more skeptical about this I have become. It's exactly the other way around for me with renewable energy technologies. The more I read about solar power and wind power, the more optimistic I become about their capacity as technologies. So this book should not be read as a blanket rejection of modern technology. It's the opposite. It's a selective critique that tries to be as concrete as possible. But when it comes to geoengineering, it has some inbuilt tendencies that point towards very problematic futures. And that is, for a start, that you can't really do it in any kind of decentralized, bottom-up fashion. You know, solid geoengineering is not like drones, for instance. You know, everyone can have a drone, do whatever you want with it. You can be Hezbollah and have a drone. You can be the Pentagon and have drones. And then you can fight it out. You can be a child and have a drone, right? But for solar geoengineering to work, it has to be one agent who does it on a planetary scale. And it's extremely difficult for me, and I think for any realistic observer, to identify this agent as anyone else than the most powerful state apparatus in the world, and that is, of course, the United States. So what we're talking about in reality, I think, is a scenario where the American state, and this would in practice mean the Pentagon, because this is a very militarized technology. It's very, you know, it's based on fighter jets and that kind of stuff. That's why Stardust Solution is positioning itself, you know, comes out of the American-Israeli military technological ecosystem. That you would have, so you would have the American military empire deploying this technology, and the idea that these people would do it in combination with a shutdown of fossil fuels is, to me, extremely unrealistic. So imagine, you know, giving this instrument to someone like Pete Hegseth, who obviously is a climate denier. And one of the beautiful things about geoengineering is that it can potentially be deployed by someone who doesn't even believe in the science of anthropogenic climate change, because all you need to say is that it's too warm in here for comfort, and we need to have a technology to get this excess heat under control. But if I'm Donald Trump, I can say that it's just too hot, and I refuse to think that it's because of my pals in the oil and gas companies that it's too hot. But we have this great new technology that we're offering here that can get us some relief. So to me, it's almost like built into the design of the technology that it's going to be deployed by the most powerful, virtually axiomatically, you know, by definition, because it doesn't work in any other way. And that means, in the real world we're living in, that it's an instrument groomed for, prepared for the people that have the greatest investments of all kinds, you know, economic, physical, libidinal, in business as usual. So I don't think that geoengineering is any kind of solution, but what I agree with, and I think we say this towards the end, is that you can imagine a scenario where the climate crisis becomes so intolerable that it's difficult to uphold a militant opposition to geoengineering, as in, you know, imagine that, as in the Ministry for the Future that you're reading, you have this kind of mega death heat wave with tens of millions of people dying, and desperate politicians deploy geoengineering. It would be very difficult in that moment to, for instance, start sabotaging that infrastructure and, I don't know, shooting down the planes or something like that because you're against geoengineering. So that perhaps you might have to suspend your hostility to it. But the morning after, you have to renew that hostility, because everyone knows that if you keep doing geoengineering while also emitting fossil fuels, you're building up a pressure cooker that will explode in the termination shock. Now, I'm compressing a difficult argument that's in the book here, but yeah. So, as much as I share your pessimism, I would hesitate, I would caution against converting that into banking on geoengineering. I think there are other ways to express this pessimism. When it comes to the question of the second part of your question, wouldn't a Leninist revolution degenerate into Stalinism? Well, when I or we talk about revolution here, I don't think we have in mind anything like what happened in 1917. It's not a Bolshevik revolution. I mean, I would love for it to be possible because I'm fundamentally a Bolshevik at heart, but we're living in a completely different political era. And when you talk about revolutionary processes today, you know, it's a fantasy that it would happen the way that it did in 1917. But what we mean when we talk about revolution, I think, is, you know, it's almost like this logical deduction, which is pretty common in climate science, that, okay, if you actually want to stay below any of these temperature limits, I mean, 1.5 is already basically a lost cause, but that just goes for 1.7 or 2 degrees as well. You need to liquidate an enormous amount of capital. You need to this is, I think, Jessica Green's point as well. You need to intervene in processes of capital accumulation at a scale that has never happened before, and declaring ongoing investments and fixed capital that is still operating basically dead. There's no logical way to avoid this deduction if you want to actually mitigate and, you know, close down these drivers. So it's almost like it's revolutionary by definition. That doesn't mean that you have to have a Bolshevik party. Does it mean that you open up for potential degeneration into an authoritarian fashion? Yes, sure. There are dangers with every kind of intervention in climate politics these days. But the dangers, I would say, of geoengineering are much greater, because geoengineering threatens us with termination shock, which basically means total combustion of the planet at some point in the future. Authoritarian degeneration is maybe a little bit more manageable in that, you know, not even Stalin managed to destroy the fundamental ecosystems that keep this planet running, but that's what could happen in geoengineering. But yes, there are risks, of course. There, you know, I've discussed, as you mentioned, sabotage. There are risks with sabotage as well. The question is, what kind of risks do we want to entertain? And right now, it's clearly the case, as you know, some of us pointed out already quite a few years ago, that it's easier to imagine manipulating incoming sunlight than to manipulating markets and investment flows. You know, it's easier to imagine intervening in something that humanity has always taken for granted, namely the amount of incoming sunlight, than it is to imagine intervening in investments and the accumulation of capital. And this is, of course, the deep pathology of our system.
I think we'll come back to this point about revolution and what it could look like in the third section. So we're going to move on to Isabel's question, but I just want to throw this point out, and then you can answer it later. But when I hear you talking about geoengineering and this one authority, I mean, if that were to happen in the current context, and I think you also mentioned this in the book, that can easily degenerate into world war, because it's about who is controlling it, and then a fight for hegemony, which is on a whole nother level than what we're already fighting for right now. But Isabel.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I think we needed the whole afternoon, but anyways, I will try to be, I will stick to the question, but I think some of it you've already touched upon. I mean, one of the aspects that you have in the book, and for the ones who have, I second Stefano's, like, read the book. It's great. It's as much as it sounds pessimistic, it's extremely entertaining as well, and it's like we laugh. I love many of the comparisons and metaphors that you use. But one of the aspects is exactly that we engage, like, with Freudian theory, like, in the end, and I thought it was very interesting, as my psychology background kind of could rely and go into it. But you talk about repression aspects, but you didn't talk about perversion, right? And I thought that was an interesting thing that was missing, because as I read about geoengineering, that's the only thing that comes to my mind, is exactly how perverse it is. Exactly because of the control, the dependency that it all can provoke. And again, as you just mentioned as well, and you just talked about, we are looking again just about this, again at the symptoms and not how to mitigate what is causing this, right? Like, it's easier, as you said, to control the sun than stop life as we know it. But as you also just presented, and I mean, as you were talking about, I just thought, like, you were describing an American movie, you know, that America comes to save the day. You know, that's like every, like, great hero American movie, I don't know, not great should not be the right word here, but, like, you know, but any bad American movie would also be on that, even, like, you know, so it's kind of the same idea, which is kind of almost is like a Hollywood idea of dealing with the world. And I mean, where did we get to, right? And regarding the geoengineering, there is also what I joked and I wrote, the circular aspect, like you're actually putting out CO2 into the, like, because you need planes, right? So you're using planes, you're putting more carbon out while you're putting the sulfate out. It's like the, you know, the snake eating its tail, you know, like, I mean, it's just like making things even, like, worse. So, and this, as I read this, and I'm like, this is so obvious, but there is clearly a system blindness. And my question is, how do we tackle the blindness? Because before the revolution, we need to tackle the blindness so we can start pushing people to move, right? So, and yeah.
Well, if I had an answer to the question of how we tackle the blindness, I would have shared it with the world a long time ago. And this goes for a lot of these how do we do this, or what is to be done questions. You know, I'm not an oracle when it comes to, you know, what do we do? When it comes to geoengineering, I think it's safe to say that if we, in this moment, in 2026, would have had a climate movement like we had in 2018-19, up until the outbreak of the pandemic, we would see much more engagement with the rise of geoengineering on the agenda. Now it is happening virtually without any kind of popular feedback, except for, perversely, in the US, where we actually do have a politically influential anti-geoengineering movement based in the Republican Party. So you have Republicans who are either committed to the chemtrail conspiracy theory, which you might have know about, or argue that, so we have these nefarious, evil politicians who believe in the climate hoax, and they're preparing to impose on us this technology called solar geoengineering, so we have to oppose it. So you have these various initiatives in legislators across the US to ban geoengineering. this is the one part of the world where you see a reaction against geoengineering, and then it comes from the far right, committed to climate denial. But there's very little civil society, if you like, engagement with this question in the present moment from anything like an enlightened, or whatever you want to call it, or let's just say scientifically literate standpoint. And this just speaks to the dismal condition of our forces in the present moment. And like I said, I mean, I really don't have any recipe for how to deal with it. I mean, there's also the, I can tell but harp on this a little bit because of my political interests in the Middle East, but there is, I think, a particularly disconcerting angle here when it comes to Israel and Palestine. And it's, you know, what we're looking at here is not only the US saving the day, but actually the state of Israel saving the day. And not only the state of Israel, but the Israeli air forces. I mean, the Stardust Solutions have conducted outdoor experiments, the first ones in the world, with the fighter jets of the Israeli state. That means the Israeli Air Forces. And this, of course, is also symptomatic, because we know that the entity occupying Palestine works as a kind of laboratory, experimenting with new technologies for destroying symptoms. Because the entire logic of counterinsurgency and, you know, the struggle against Palestinian resistance from the occupation is that there is a cause that we can't deal with, and the cause is the colonization of Palestine. And this driver we just continue with. This generates a lot of symptoms that we try to annihilate with one fancy technology or other. And for many years, of course, this was the paradigmatic example here was the Iron Dome, that as soon as the resistance from Gaza shot rockets, you would try to pluck them down with Iron Dome. And geoengineering is like a planetary Iron Dome. But what that ends with, you know, eventually is the total destruction of Gaza, because you never dealt with the drivers. And this is the whole logic of the Palestine laboratory that produces these technologies and gives them to the West for destroying one symptom or another when you can't deal with the causes. So that's why you have this fantastic production of these surveillance technologies and various kinds of high-tech military technologies coming out of this laboratory. And now you also have it in the form of Stardust Solutions. And in a world just slightly more ideal than the one we have now, we would have a very strong and powerful Palestine solidarity movement that could tackle this issue also. But you know, the Palestine solidarity movement is in a state quite similar to the climate movement now, which is a state of complete exhaustion and sense of general defeat, because the Palestine solidarity movement tried to stop a genocide for several years and brought out, you know, unprecedented numbers of people on the streets around the world to try to do this. And what we have now is just total genocide stasis in Gaza. We're just, you know, total normalization and continuation of the genocide. So the movement is deflated, just like the climate movement. And the attempts we have to revive it, and the attempts we have to also, you know, articulate Palestine and climate with, you know, heroic initiatives by everyone from Greta Thunberg to local activists here in Copenhagen. They run up against so powerful enemies that we make very, very little impact. And this makes it difficult for activist initiatives to tackle something like geoengineering, because, you know, we have achieved so little, and this thing that is coming towards us is so big, and, you know, the system just keeps throwing this major disaster one after another against us, and it leaves us with a very, very limited capacity to intervene. That's how I think many people feel about this. And if I knew how to change this, I would give an indication. Yeah.
So I want to ask a slightly different question, although I think the answer won't be any less pessimistic, so you have to hold on some hope. But so to go back to the tech part, because actually a lot of the book is looking at these technologies, and when you're reading it, I mean, you can't help but the absurdity of it all. So you have these techpreneurs who are coming up with these technologies, many of them who are not scientists, or who are scientists, but they're not that kind. Like, they don't understand these technologies, and yet they're inventing all these things and raising venture capital, and actually in some cases producing, the whole point is to produce offset credits that they can sell. And then they are selling it, and then firms who are producing CO2 are buying it. But none of these technologies actually work, or no one is even looking to see if any of these technologies actually work. So you're selling something that is a fake thing. You're selling offsets, but they're not offsetting anything. And so it's a huge farcical bubble. But some of the biggest companies and biggest investors, they're all playing this game. And when you read it the way that you write it, it's both funny and not funny at the same time. And you kind of, half joking, half not joking, in the book, call this, if I understood correctly, bourgeois degeneracy, a bit. And it's funny to do that, right? But I think it's not sufficient. And I'm not asking you to come up with an answer, but I think we also have to ask, how did we get here? We are in a business school, so I think this is the right place to say, right? I mean, the companies that are driving, these are Silicon Valley firms. They are using the Silicon Valley model as it evolved now, which we could point to many other ways where it's gone wrong. But in the past, in the 70s, this generated for us computers. This generated, massive things that we saw as a good thing, right? But it's just turned into something so farcical. I mean, the idea that they thought that they could commercialize sequestering is also farcical, okay? So you have a business model that says, I'm going to capture carbon and I'm going to put it away and not do anything with it. So how are you going to make money? And then later they think, oh, I can't make money with this, so now we got to give it back, right? But how did they think they were ever going to make money? So you're just left with this kind of, absurdity that also needs to be explained. And I think maybe this links into, sometimes in the book, you waver between an outright dismissal of capitalism and only a partial dismissal of capitalism. So now I'm going to raise my question I asked you at lunch, which is, does this mean that capitalism can't save us? It's also posed in the first panel where we discussed capitalism with a big C, pointing to Lara, who told me to say capitalism with a big C. But, do you dismiss it as, and this will lead us into the second part where we talk about how do we stop fossil fuel burning, right? But I can see arguments both ways. I personally think that we can change capitalism to be what we want it to be, but I just wanted to hear your take on that. Because if that is true, then we are looking at 3 revolutions. Like, first we have to overthrow capitalism, and then we have to, or maybe 2. First we have to overthrow capitalism to get mitigation, and then we need to enact public goods. I'm bridging into your question because I'm afraid we're about to run out of time, but the People's Commiserate that oversees removal, right? So I think we'll move into the second part, which is how can we stop fossil fuels if we don't see any way to do it through capitalist systems?
Well, first of all, again, there are several big questions wrapped into one here. But first of all, I think as farcical as the whole scene of CDR technologies has become, there was a kind of rationality to it, which in hindsight isn't, I think, so difficult to discern. There was a moment when people expected that climate mitigation in one form or another will happen. Governments will have to institute caps on emissions. And within those caps, then, you get presumably an interest from companies to continue emit that has to be met with offsets. Or, the whole notion of offsets, which was so central to post-Kyoto climate politics, is of course recycled in the CDR lingo. But credits for CO2 drawn down works in a similar way. And the expectation that a market like this would materialize was in a way rational, because it assumed that policymakers would be guided by science and reason in at least the minimal sense that, okay, they might not totally destroy fossil capital, which is what I think they would do, they should do, but they will create some form of green capitalism, some form of, okay, we have to limit our emissions, but within these limits, there will be flexibility. And that's where the market mechanisms come in, and you can come up with your technologies for capturing CO2, and you can sell them. So I don't think it was entirely irrational to, for instance, start a company like Climeworks that for a time generated so much hype around direct air capture, and that started selling even, just sequestered, presumably mineralized CO2 in the ground in Iceland as some kind of, virtue diplomas for rich consumers to buy. And now Climeworks is in a massive crisis too, because it turns out that their DAC doesn't work anywhere near as effectively as they said it would, and it's still way more expensive than they had promised that it would be. So one god after another here, it goes down. One fetish after another, it turns out to be just empty hype. This is the general trend. So why does it keep happening? Why is it still this situation that, climate politics, like almost every other kind of politics, is drowning in technology, it's drowning in contraptions, it's drowning in devices. But this is almost like a universal trend in our society. This is what we're doing in our private lives with our smartphones. I have children. Everyone who has children these days knows that interaction with children is 99% about devices, right? You have AI and you have everything just rolling in a tidal wave of us, occupying. Military warfare is all about technology. Everything is drowning in technology. How do we understand this? Where does it come from? Yeah. I would say that the one book that I've read this year that sheds some light on this is an old book published in the 1950s by a guy called Günther Anders, only now translated into English, called The Obsolescence of the Human. This is maybe the most powerful non-fiction book I've read in a very long time. And it argues that there is something that he calls the Promethean gap, or sometimes it's translated into the Promethean gradient, that human beings with our intelligence have a tendency to produce one technology after another that take on momentum of their own and start to dominate us, and that we can't keep up with these technologies because we're almost like too smart for ourselves and just inventing one ingenious device after another, without having any kind of politics or ethics that keep up with them. And he wrote in the age of the nuclear bomb, in the age of television and radio, but it's like as if he wrote this book for the present moment with AI and everything else. Is this an explanation that is sufficient? I don't think so, but it points to the great task of critical scholars here to try to understand what is it in society, what is it in humanity that produces this excess of technology that is drowning us in every sphere of our lives. Yeah. I might come off as a little bit of a Luddite here, but I generally am a Luddite with some notable exceptions. I like cargo bikes, I like solar power and things like that. On the question of capitalism, so, like I said, I'm personally committed to revolutionary Marxist politics, even disregarding the whole problem of climate. But I'm not one of those people who would say that, okay, to have any chance of dealing with the climate problem, we first have to abolish capitalism, because that is totally to flip things around and put the cart before the horse. We've tried to abolish capitalism for centuries, and we're farther away from ever from reaching that goal, because we as a left, anti-capitalist forces generally in the world today are at their weakest point ever since, I don't know, before the First International or whatever. So to say that, okay, we first have to abolish capitalism, and then once we've done that, we're going to deal with the climate crisis, is obviously to engage in a kind of left fantasy similar to these unicorns of the tech capitalists. That's not going to happen. What we have to do is to try to push for transitional demand. So things that need to be done to start the process of shutting down fossil capital and leaving fossil fuels in the ground. And the one case that I could point to, and that I nowadays always rant on if I have a chance, is Colombia, where you have a government that has actually made very ambitious attempt to shut down fossil fuels. But I don't know if we have time to talk with that. But it's the kind of actually existing radical politics that you can point to and see, okay, it's actually possible to shut down the fossil fuel industry, because they're doing it in Colombia. And that's a total exception. It's very isolated, even just in a Latin American context, where every other major fossil fuel producing country on that continent is just going all out to maximize production. But this notion that, okay, we have to do 3 revolutions or whatever wrapped in one when revolutionary forces are at their weakest state ever is obviously a total mismatch. But that's logical because it's, the need for revolution corresponds to our incapacity to pull it off. If we had been powerful, we wouldn't have had this glut of catastrophes.
So I think we'll move on to and maybe pick. You have 2 questions left, but maybe pick the one you like the most to pose about. So how do we? I think that's. So how do we stop fossil capital, right? But they want to pose it. Isabel and Stefano both have a couple of specific questions to you about how do we do this.
So I came to the end of the book, and I was hoping to find the eco-socialist manifesto at the end, right? Because, I mean, of course, this is not the Bolshevik moment right now, but that in 17 they had Marx and Engels' manifesto in hand, and there was some guidance there. Is this coming in the 3rd book? And if not, can you tell us where to go for inspiration, just intellectually, if not materially? And what are given the fractionalist class system that we have now, what kind of alliances do you have in mind? I mean, you mentioned already Extinction Rebellion is in crisis, Fridays for the Future, is what it is now. The Gilets jaunes, if anything, they taught us that maybe the working class as a concept is not going to go for climate revolution. So I'm going to leave it at that, so that I really, and you do come out as a pragmatist pessimist here, and can we build on the bit of the vision here and the guidance? Help us out.
Yeah. Okay. So it's funny because there have been other readers who've said exactly the same thing, or funny, maybe it's tragic, but Kim Stanley Robinson, for instance, he said you need to write a 3rd book where you explain what are we going to do. Well, I don't know that Wim and I are capable of doing this. Maybe Wim is a little bit more capable than I, but I don't have like a ready-made program. But we're actually considering writing 1 book, which would be a book about Colombia. I'm personally, I don't really like utopias, or I have a good friend, Troy Vitisse, who wrote this book, Half Earth Socialism, which is very much like, okay, here's a fantasy of all the good things we could do. But when it comes to actual politics, I think it makes much more sense to look at concrete examples. And the concrete example that we have is Colombia. Now, I'm just going to, because you're pushing me here, I'm just going to take a few moments to say a little bit more on Colombia.
Wait until the elections next
I know. But so what we had in Colombia was, as you might know, in 2020, for the first time, a left-wing president coming to power. And on the campaign trail, he promised that I'm not going to give any new licenses to any fossil fuel infrastructure. No new pipelines, coal mines, drilling for oil, anything. And of course, it's very common that politicians make high-flown promises on the campaign trail, but here he has actually stuck to his promises. So during these 4 years of left-wing rule in Colombia, which is the 3rd most important fossil fuel producing country in Latin America, whose social formation for decades has been completely based on the production of oil and coal, the bulk of export revenues coming from these 2 commodities, has actually stood by the promise and not given any new license to fossil fuel infrastructure, which is remarkable because it goes in exactly the opposite way as the rest of the world since 2020, when you had the start of the enormous profit bonanza in the wake of the pandemic and the Ukraine invasion, and virtually the entire world has moved towards doubling down on fossil fuel production. And Colombia went the other way and said this is actually possible, and we've had coal and oil output in Colombia plummeting in those years, because if you don't renew the infrastructure, if you don't drill for new fields, and you don't replenish your assets, then you deplete them and you end end up with declining output. That's what's happening, and it's on purpose. And this is, of course, exactly what is required if we're going to have any chance of getting this crisis under control. And this is what the International Energy Agency famously said towards the late 2010s, that if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees, we can't have any new fossil fuel infrastructure. And Colombia actually showed, well, you can turn this into government policy. So it's possible. And, you know, this is an important reminder that everything that's happened in recent years hasn't happened because of some kind of natural or technological necessity, but because of a balance of forces in politics. And there was this one country that showed humanity what could actually be done. Now, when I was in Colombia and sat down with the president and talked about these things and traveled around in the fossil fuel landscapes, the oil regions, the coal regions last April and May, there was this general resignation that the left is going to lose the election in 2026. Now, this election is going to happen in May, and it looks different. So in the recent polls, the Pacto Histórico candidate is actually leading very significantly. So this is not Petro. He can't stand again because the constitution rules that out. But it's the inheritor of his political project who, if he would win, would keep it going. He's not a committed climate activist like Petro is, but he would clearly keep it going because it's working very well. And one reason the left is surging, paradoxically, in the polls, and one reason why Petro has become extremely popular towards the end of his period, is the aggression from Donald Trump in the Caribbean and the killing of the fisher folk on the coast, and the invasion of Venezuela, and Petro's pretty smart way of dealing with this, and of course opposing Trump, but without incurring another invasion. And it's also because this political project has actually improved people's lives and managed to do things like raise the minimum wage and create concrete, small, but still significant reforms, despite the right holding a majority Congress. So quite impressive that they've pulled this off in Colombia. So what we want to do is we want to write a short book, and I imagine it could be called something like The Case of Colombia, One Country Against Catastrophe, because it really is one country, very isolated. And we don't know, it might even come to an end if the right wins the elections. Maybe the second round, the right will unite and defeat the left. We don't know. If it survives this election, it's going to be an even more isolated case, because Latin America, as every other part of the world, is being taken over by the far right. And the Brazilian comrade here knows how likely that is to happen in Brazil as well later this year. And Colombia also stands out for its totally unique position on the genocide in Palestine and the coal embargo, but I don't have the time to go into that. But it's
so I wanted to let Isabel come into the conversation.
Yes, and I will, to add to your Colombia book, you should also look into Uruguay, because they have changed. And they are no longer using fossil fuels. They don't pumping. They don't have the fuels, but they changed their energy to 98% renewable. So that's, if you put maybe those two together, they have like a roadmap, and that's actually on the point of, again, I mean, about the blindness, right? What you're talking about, not a lot of people know about. The same thing with Uruguay, and we were just like, okay, so how can we bring this out? But I mean, when I was reading the book, I was talking to Lindsay, and I was saying, like, you know, if all the money that has been given to all these ideas, these crazy, impossible, we know, going nowhere ideas, right? We're giving to stop people to pump. Sure. You know, so if that's one thing that could be a way, but and maybe that in not the manifesto, only the manifesto, but you know, if maybe this country should lead something like I wrote here, the People Commissariat for Removal or the Climate NATO, like it's time to come together, right? We need to come together. And when I asked you about how to tackle the system blindness, I'm not thinking of one bullet, but which steps is exactly that. Like, I mean, we need to go somewhere. If we can also, if we look into the urban sprawls, you know, like, can they be part of the solution? Can we look at, and you know, I told you, like, I started a garden here, so like, how can we push at least to some other perspectives on development, but developing maybe the right thing? I mean, like recovering our soil, kind of going more into regenerative, you know, eating less meat that we talked about, like kind of these little steps that we combined, you know, we can do something. And yeah, your thoughts on that, and that's exactly what I wrote here, is like what, you know, who should lead and what could be the first action to happen in this roadmap? Like what could we be our, you know, first step?
Yeah, so I'm in favor of all of these things that you mentioned, and of course we shouldn't admire an example like Colombia so much that we forget about all the small things that can be done close to home. And I mean, like I said, I support all of these things. And, you know, this is also the approach that you should take to CDR. If we're going to do it, we have to do a lot of different things, but on a relatively small scale. Because it's when you bank on one miraculous technology and you try to extrapolate it to a mega scale that you're doomed to fail, basically. Yeah. So, you know, shifting to a planetary, to a plant-based diet, and you know, all of these micro shifts that you can do on an urban scale, and even on a neighborhood scale, or even on a household scale. Of course, they can build up into some kind of aggregate force. And then, of course, you have the whole question which you raised over lunch that we haven't even come to yet, which is like, what is the impact of this ongoing war? Because I think it is still an ongoing war on the whole trajectory of any kind of energy transition and things like that. So, yeah, you know, some would say that you should have every reason to be extremely hopeful now because this is the end of fossil fuels, what we're seeing. I'm not so sure about that, but as pessimistic as we are, or as I am at least, this should never be a reason for passivity. It should be a reason for the opposite. You know, it's precisely because things so far have gone in the wrong direction that we have to, you know, exert even more force in trying to produce some kind of openings and positive moves. Yeah.
So we're going to open it up to the floor. Of course, there'll be another chance to come back and to engage. But just to end on that point, I mean, when you've read the, I think the reason why they're all asking you, what should we do, what can be done, is because when you get to the end of the book, you're so angry, and you're so sad, and you're so like, the world's gonna die. And it's like, what do you do? And then there's nowhere to channel that energy, right? So I think that's where these questions are coming from. It's like, where do we take, so your book is so good at eliciting that emotion and that desire to act. But then what do we do with that desire to act? But we'll now open the floor, and Dominic has the mic. Remember, you just need to talk into the mic. It's not going to make a loud noise. So you need to articulate. So we'll start on this side, and then we will come to this side. So we'll just group the questions, so you need to write them down.
Thank you very much. I'm speaking into the mic.
Introduce who you are, please.
My name is Laura Hohn, University of Roskilde. Thank you so much for this really depressing discussion and very important questions also. I have 3 points that I would like to make. The first one is, the Eco-Socialist Manifesto exists. It was published by the Fourth International in November last year. It's been discussed in various contexts. It's Trotskyist rather than Bolshevik, so, you know, politics always come in, but it does exist. It names explicitly geoengineering, right? So political programs exist. They're just full of contradictions, might be run by people you don't agree with, right? So we come into the politics that you already mentioned. The second one is, and thank you for mentioning Kim Stanley Robinson. This is, you know, I'm a political economist, so I completely get, you know, sticking to the facts and looking for concrete cases. But it is just as much a crisis of imagination. Now, there is, out there, science fiction that plays out the geoengineering, in particular, the solar geoengineering scenario. Watch Snowpiercer. Watch the film first, the series isn't quite as good. And then watch everything else by that particular director. But then there's a wonderful, no, actually it's quite not wonderful, there's an Apple TV series, actually, it's called Extrapolations, couple of years old, couple of episodes, which plays out solar geoengineering and all the politics of it. It's really not actually that good, that storyline, and it's Apple that produced it. Lots of contradictions there, right? But so one of the problems that we have now with the climate movement is that everybody in the neighbor is reading Solarpunk. Don't know if you know Solarpunk. It's wonderful, it's happy, it's hopeful. none of it talks about solar engineering, because, can we even have a communal, progressive form of solar engineering for some of the questions and some of the contradictions you addressed about termination shock? But this is a question for all of us. Where do we get these positive stories and ideas from that could actually mobilize to do something? Because the sci-fi of the tech fix, that's all there, and we all believe in it, and our governments believe in it. So we need something else on the other side. We need imagination. The third one is also for all of us in the room, and maybe all those people online. What is the role of scientists in all of this? There are lots of scientists, initiatives against geoengineering. There's moratoriums, there's scientists' warnings. They're just not being heeded. Apparently, we're not shouting loud enough. We have all that knowledge. What can we collectively do to actually make a contribution in this battle? Thank you.
Dominic, there are two down here, and then we'll go over there to Jacobo.
Yeah, his hand. Yeah, first.
Thank you. Sune Haubölle from Roskilde University. Maybe building a little bit on Laura's points. You're basically illustrating that that it's a blind alley to follow the market, and the market won't solve the problems, even though the knowledge is there. It might listen to some research, it might listen to some knowledge, but at the end of the day, it's profit-oriented. So what you really need is global solutions at some level of global governance. Of course, we don't have a world state. We have powerful states. How do you view the idea of a climate state? So I suppose one idea is that civil society and climate science together pushes democratically individual states to adopt some of these solutions that we talk about, and then they push at a global level towards hopefully we can reach it within 5 or 10 years. Then maybe some of these solutions can be adopted collectively. Because the way I view it, we do have some positive signs at the global level. If you look at the UN, they produce these very elaborate and scientifically solid reports. The climate panel, the International Climate Panel, and we have levels of informed policy making at the UN level. So I think part of the crisis we're looking at here is the crisis of the UN to actually exercise power. Could we perhaps get there if we suppose that individual states turn more towards a climate state, and we can reach a sort of global climate state that way around? It's not your line of thinking at all, but I thought I would bring it in.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the interesting panel. Tobias Pfor from the University of Copenhagen. I sort of wanted to touch upon two topics that you hadn't talked about, and just wanted to hear how you think they fit into the story. And the first is China, right? And one storyline is it's certainly decarbonizing faster than many people expected compared to possibly 10 years ago. They also have their interest in geoengineering. They also, have by now a technological advantage, at least in many parts of solars and batteries. So, maybe they wouldn't let the United States sort of do their own geoengineering without anything. So, how do you see the geopolitical tension between the United States and China in this area? And is China offering an additional avenue which maybe can help with the problem? And then the second topic is sort of, you talked about the technology, but clearly with AI, one of the things, at least compared to 10 years ago, our need for energy just in that area has gone up massively. And one of the avenues that's now discussed much more than maybe 10 years ago is the revival of nuclear, particularly, small nuclear reactors. So where do you stand on nuclear as an avenue to at least compensate for the increases in energy we will witness because of data science?
Dominic, I take Jacobo's question.
Thank you for the panel, and thank you, Andreas. I just want to react about Colombia. I have been working in La Guajira the last 6 years. So last year, 20 children die in La Guajira because they don't have water, they don't have food. Petro has this policy that in Colombia, the 69% of the energy matrix come from hydro. Ecopetrol, is the company that owns runs the oil in Colombia. I mean, they use the money and they need to have the money to run the country because they don't have other income. So Ecopetrol is not going away anywhere. And they just found last March a new gas in the offshore of La Guajira. So they will partner with Brazil to explore, to get this gas. So it's the utopia saying that they're not doing this oil. So what is happening now when it comes to China, China is providing solar panels in La Guajira, and Denmark is providing the wind farms. So when you're saying that going away and transition, so now we're using more technology in order to produce energy. So then what is the transition are you talking about? Because it's not changing one technology to another, and they're not using another kind of way to produce their own energy. And then there is no capacity building. For example, they say Cerrejón, the coal mining will pass out the 2030. But this is also utopia because there is a demand in Netherlands, in Denmark, to have more coal for producing energy. So we don't see it's really Cerrejón will close down in 2030. So hopefully we'll be alive, according to your book, to see this happening. So we need to be careful about these big statements because in reality it's another story that we see.
Thank you. So I think we'll stop here for this round, but there will be a second round, so please think of other questions, and also we will take questions from online at that time. But I'd like to stop there because there's a lot of really good questions and points. So I'll turn first to Andreas, but Isabel and Stefano, you're welcome to come in. It should be a conversation, also a discussion. So.
Yeah, you need to stop me if I talk too much and speak for too long. And these are all big questions. First of all, thank you for mentioning the Eco-Socialist Manifesto. And of course, I should have pointed that out more. I mentioned Troy, but of course, there are a lot of people who have produced various kinds of, 10-point programs or whatever. I think even I dabbled with one a few years ago, even though this is not my favorite genre, as I said. But yeah, I mean, there's no shortage of ideas about what can be done. That's entirely correct. Now, what's the role of scientists, or what's the role of intellectuals, people doing intellectual work more generally in a moment like this? This is something we could discuss for a long time also. I personally have always thought of my own intellectual work as necessarily being in some kind of dialogue with social movements. You mentioned how to blow up a pipeline, and for instance, when I wrote that, it was towards the end of this whole wave of climate activism back in towards the end of the 2010s. And written in, in the sense of kind of an urgent, ongoing discussion within the movement. Now, because of the current state of the climate movement, it's very difficult to do research and have the feeling that what I'm doing feeds into a movement that is, advancing on the streets or whatever. So the question is, what do you do as an activist scholar when there's very little activism happening? Yeah, you try to keep the flame alive, or maybe even write messages in a bottle, as Adorno and the people of the Frankfurt School would have it, in a moment that's in a way very similar to the one we have at present. And I'd be happy to discuss that in much more detail, but maybe in the interest of time we can leave it there. But yeah, I mean, try to stay as relevant as possible for any kind of flare up of activism, I imagine, is the task in a lull or downswing like the one we're having right now. And who knows? I mean, if things really start burning later this year, who knows if there might be a new popular reaction? I mean, I, for one, did not at all during the very extreme summer we had in 2018 expect Greta Thunberg and her movement to kick off. I was in a moment of complete despair just moments before this enormous upsurge of climate activism that we had. And if there is any reason left in this species, then we will see something similar, something unexpected when disaster strikes. So who knows? On the question of the climate state and many states and things like that, well, the UN, I think the UN, speaking of spent forces, as you said, I mean, really is in a deep structural crisis because it's being replaced by the Board of Peace or whatever. But I agree with you that what we can envision is precisely a democratic takeover by individual nation states, by progressive forces that then try to export their model and line up with other forces. And that is, of course, exactly what Colombia has been trying to do. And I'll come back to Colombia in response to the last question. But the ongoing conference in Santa Marta is an example of precisely this kind of dynamic. And in a way, and I'll come back again to the contradictions and the limitations of the Colombian experiment, but in a way, the Colombian experience fits into almost an ideal type of what this kind of politics would look like. Because what you had was a groundswell of popular protest that was converted into an electoral campaign that managed to win a democratic election, and then you have a government that is pursuing particular kind of policies and tries to get other states on board and break its isolation and have the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty kind of anchored in the Colombian experiment, but drawing in other actors. So this kind of breaks climate politics down to what can we do in our particular states. And there are some countries in Europe where you can imagine something like the Colombian scenario. The one that I would point to is still France, where you actually have a left force that is still, at least expected to reach the second stage of their presidential campaign. And I think the LFI really stands out as a remarkable political force in the generally catastrophic landscape of left politics in Europe. Apart from France, we don't have many cases to point to. I mean, Spain is a very interesting case in terms of climate politics and every other kind of politics, but it has a different dynamic. Anyway, what this kind of boils down again is to national politics, basically, and what you can do in terms of climate on a national level and how you can maybe build up. So I think my vision of how these things could happen sounds like it's pretty similar to yours. On China. Where's the comment you asked about China? Yeah. So China, I often get questions about China because I speak very little about China, and China is obviously the elephant in a room if you leave it out. I know very little about China. I haven't done any kind of research on China in 15 years, more than 15 years. I wrote a little paper a long time ago, but since then, basically nothing. But, I think the energy landscape in China is contradictory, as in so many places, that, this idea that China is engaging in full-out decarbonization, I think is a little bit difficult to square with the data that we have about the build-out of coal-fired power plants and coal mines in recent years. I think China is going for a very promiscuous, all kinds of energy approach rather than an actual transition, which in the Chinese case, given the fact that China doesn't have any oil and gas really reserves on its own, has translated into this extremely advanced production of renewable energy technologies, which is, of course, a fantastic thing, even though it has some problems. But this opens the whole can of worms, the whole big question of are we in an energy transition, and how does it relate to the geopolitical situation? And maybe we can come back to it if we have time. But just on the question of geoengineering, well, this is also something I had a discussion about this book with my comrade Joel Wainwright, who said that it's much more likely that China is the one who's going to do the geoengineering first because they're much more technologically advanced. But I don't know what the evidence for this is. I don't know of any evidence that there is a research program into sulfate aerosol injection or any kind of geoengineering technology in China. What we do know is that they do weather manipulation, as so many of the other countries. They do cloud seeding to try to modify the local weather. This is like some kind of a intermediate between adaptation and geoengineering that a lot of countries are experimenting with around the world now to try to grapple with drought and other climate disasters. But I think the research and the technology are much more advanced in the US with Israel and the UK and other allies as well. And this idea that would China let the US do geoengineering? Well, so far, with all the talk, about China being this rising hegemon or this challenger to the US, I think the remarkable thing is that they let the US do whatever the US wants to do without ever fighting back. They're just turning the other cheek all the time. They invade Venezuela. What did China do? They invade Iran. What did China do? China never does anything against the US. I mean, we're in a totally different situation from during the Cold War when there were actual limitations to US projection of power. Nowadays, for all the talk of American decline, the US is entirely free to intervene anywhere in the world and have its fleet outside of the Chinese coast. And what does China do about it? So I very much doubt that if the US would pull off geoengineering, then China would start some kind of a military action against that. It's much more likely the other way around. That if China were to start geoengineering, the US would shut that down. Because the country that starts geoengineering has control of the entire planetary climate. The US would never let China do that. In its current iteration, the US would seize that monopoly immediately. So that's why you already have this advanced system in the US for detecting any kind of geoengineering experiments around the world, because the US wants to know who tries to do this. And it's only the US that has such a system in place. But this again opens up to the whole question of geopolitics, and I am personally skeptical about the whole narrative about American decline. On Colombia, yeah, so I painted a very rosy picture because I had to tell the story very fast, but I'm very well aware of the limitations and contradictions of the Colombian experiment. When I was there and traveled last spring, I wrote a long piece in Jacobin based on travels in La Guajira, for instance, and in Barranca Bermeja, and discussed Ecopetrol as one of the sources of resistance against this transition, because Ecopetrol is a major capitalist corporation in the Colombian social formation and is trying to sustain itself. But I think, for instance, when you bring up this question of, so the renewable energy technologies that are imported come from outside, that's true, but there are also quite a lot of ideas in Colombia about how more of this production could be made domestic. A kind of an ecological Raul Prebisch import substitution project that comrades are working on there. So I think there are a lot of interesting things going on in Colombia, which is not to say that it's some kind of utopia, but that's precisely my point, that what's happening in Colombia is actual, ongoing, real political struggle, which is always filled with mistakes and setbacks and limitations. And of course, Colombia is, just by the fact that it's so isolated, it finds itself in a very difficult spot. Yeah. Oh, I didn't answer the question on nuclear. Do I have to do that? Okay, so very quickly, I don't think that this idea that, okay, we have to produce more electricity to feed the AI monster, so therefore we have to have nuclear, is the right way to go. I would be much more inclined to say, we don't need these data centers. Close them down. And use the energy we need for real, actual, basic human needs. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to jump in because I think, there is the climate NATO, which is something I had asked about before, and you mentioned about it. And during lunch, one of the things that we talked about was the fact that, the invisibility, right, and which is also linked to the blindness. The fact that, the people who are going to be most affected about the climate, it's going to be, again, the people who are already not seen, right? So it's happening over there. It's those, and then it's so maybe, and now you're talking about Colombia, and obviously the whole idea of the global south versus the global north. Could it be that actually the climate NATO then is something that is sparked through, the union of the countries that will be mostly affected? That will be mostly that we would see. We could hope, maybe in a science fiction utopian, hopeful person that I still am, that we would see some movement in that. And the other one is exactly and I've been talking about this for a very long time, but it's related, is exactly the stock market, the role of the stock market in this. Because I always say, if the markets were giving money to the good causes, we're not going to be in this situation, right? So it's this. So if that would also be a way. So that's just What are your thoughts on
the stock markets?
On the stock market, and also the kind of this force rising from the south?
This force rising from the south is, I think, what they're trying to sketch at the conference in Santa Marta. I look forward to Wim coming back and giving me a report and hearing what others say about it. It's made quite a splash in media, this conference. I mean, there's been a lot of reports about it. I'm surprised by the amount of reports that I've seen. But there's this talk that this could be like a Porto Alegre moment for the climate movement, but with states on board from the beginning. And it's of course symbolic that it's rising from the south. And again, the initiative in climate politics really has migrated from the global north, if it ever was there, to the south with what's happening in Colombia. And so this is the best thing we have to hope for and work with, I think, at the present moment. But who knows how long even this project will survive. On stock markets, well, Overshoot, the prequel to this book, writes a lot about stock markets and the whole notion of asset stranding and the idea of the carbon bubble, and that you could have a meltdown of stock markets if a state put a serious limit on fossil fuel extraction at a certain point. Colombia is too puny to set off something like that. But if you imagine that Bernie Sanders would have come to power and would have said what he would have if he would have implemented his promises, you could have had a total meltdown in the stock markets because so much capital is connected to fossil fuel extraction. And that didn't happen, obviously. But if this is the whole idea of the carbon bubble or asset stranding. If you have actual mitigation happening at scale for real at some point, you risk setting off a financial crisis much bigger than anything that we've seen before. And as we argued in Overshoot, this is one reason that it's not happening, because the inertia and the structural imperative to keep going is so strong, precisely because the opposite would just prick the bubble and you would have an implosion. And I think what we're seeing now, if we again get drawn back to the question of the war, situation is very contradictory, but clearly the profit bonanza that's lining up this year, it might very well reach the level of or even surpass what we saw in 2022. So, ExxonMobil, Repsol, Equinor, they're drowning in profits because of the rising oil prices and because they have assets to pour out from elsewhere than the Gulf. And you see contradictions in a place like Spain, for instance, which really has an exceptional government in Europe. It's like the Colombia of Europe. Everything is relative, but because the insanity is so extreme everywhere else, Spain stands out as this, country of sanity when it comes to Palestine, when it comes to immigration, when it comes to climate, the three big issues of our time. The Sanchez government is pursuing, extraordinarily sane policies, again, relatively speaking. And you see that the large renewable sector is buffering Spain against the price shocks from the war in Iran, which has led some to point, okay, look, Spain is the example. It shows what can be done and how we protect ourselves. But what people forget there is that if you look at the capitalist social formation of Spain, the second largest company in that country is Repsol. And the largest company is Bank Santander, which of course has its money deep in the pockets of Repsol. Now, Repsol is booming like hell right now because oil is pouring in from Venezuela after the raid and after the kidnapping of Maduro. And Repsol is making massive profits out of the high oil prices. So you have this, it's very strange disarticulation between, on the one hand, the hardcore of capital accumulation in Spain, which is booming thanks to fossil fuels and their high prices, and then you have this nice social democratic prime minister who's instituting these good renewable progressive politics, and how do they align? I don't know. And this is just an example of the contradictory situations in the world at large right now.
Stefano, I think you also had a question along this line.
Sort of continuing this kind of conversation about instruments and about market mechanisms. And I wanted to highlight 2 or 3 things. So going back to Jessica Green's existential politics, basically, she's not fighting against the system of capitalism per se, but she's trying to find ways within contemporary capitalism that a big difference can be made. And part of it, her oral argument is about the revaluation of green assets and the devaluation of fossil assets. So like you and many of us, she's against carbon pricing, she's against carbon credits. Net zero is a bad word, and for good reasons. But then an alternative is to say, well, we can actually work politically with market instruments and incentives in order to enact that, in particular through smart green industrial policy. Lindsay has worked on it, a lot of other people at CBS. Do you think that that kind of approach is against the grain of a more revolutionary approach? Is there a space for that? How much space is there? Given that, you know better than I do, Brett Christopher's whole argument, part of the argument in his book is that solar is not profitable enough. So through essentially, if we are within the system, then capital accumulation cannot take place in the same way as in fossil fuels. Therefore, yes, there are limitations even if we stay within. So there's a lot of contradictory but also very rich discussions around how to work within the system and to what extent one can. I'll stop at that for now.
Yeah, so I haven't read Jessica Green's book, but I've read a couple of her articles, and if I remember correctly, she advocated inducing asset stranding, or setting this off, and that we have to liquidate. So I need to read the book, but I think I'm close to her take on this. And you can maybe see that I kind of oscillate between, on the one hand, extremely pessimistic, critical theory, everything is fucked, positions on the one hand, and then, gesturing towards some kind of revolutionary politics, and then also ending up with very small-scale reformist and the whole Colombian thing. Mm-hmm. But this is not, I admit that this is not consistent. This is like a grasping for what are the meaningful positions to take in a moment like this. When it comes to, let's call them sub-revolutionary initiatives that don't reach the level of any kind of large-scale revolution that have to do with support for renewables or something like that. I'm, again, in favor of that. Mm-hmm. And I think that what you can see at the present moment, in this moment of enormous rise in oil and gas prices, is that the space is opened for various kinds of subsidies or industrial policies by governments and other public sector agents to promote the diffusion and adoption of solar and wind. And that is when you see the expansion of renewables. It's when you have actors that are not guided by maximum profit, in some way putting in place incentives or opportunities for adopting renewables, that it tends to happen. And that's when the potential that is in renewables, which is to get very, very cheap electricity without fossil fuels, is realized. It's when you take away the profit imperative. Because when the profit imperative decides, you will get even more capital flowing into fossil fuels, which is also what you're seeing happening. Yeah.
But I think one of the arguments that came up on the first panel when I was talking about Brett Christopher's book, when you read it closely, I think there's a distinction between the profit imperative per se and what financial capital wants. And this is specific to the West, and it's specific to this time period. And so if we're talking about actions that could happen at the sub-revolutionary level. So, yeah, stranding fossil fuel assets and reevaluation of green assets, but also addressing financialization, the power of financial shareholders. Mm-hmm. It's killing our society in more ways than one, but climate change is a good one, but also in other ways. Why are we falling behind manufacturing and technology? Because we just need to pay out all the money. companies are paying out more money than they make, and then they're raising money on bond markets to pay out more money. Like, most people don't really know how this is working. Companies are generally not raising money on stock markets. The stock market is taking money out of our corporations. So also, in some of the very interesting literature on China, one of the reasons why China is able to commercialize renewables more quickly is because firms don't have the same expectation about their profit margin. And we're not talking about this. Yeah?
Exactly.
I think we have time for more questions or comments. There's some over here. Don't forget to say your name.
Hi everyone, thanks for the lovely discussion so far. It's been really informative. I would love for you guys to delve a bit more into the geopolitics of the energy transition. Basically the way I see it is China is offering this public good, kind of piggybacking off of your argument there, Lindsay, that they don't have the same profit incentive when they produce, let's say, solar panels. So they can offer them really cheap to the rest of the world. That's basically the only reason why we can do it at scale, and it's somewhat profitable, at least until recently in Europe. So how does this relate in a world that's dominated by US hegemony, which is to a large extent based off of their fossil fuel dominance and like something like the petrodollar, where other countries are dependent on oil, which means that they are then dependent on US dollars because they need to pay for that oil in that. So the way I see it is China is offering a way out of this US dependence on dollars and on fossil fuels, even though China in itself has all these contradictions.
And there are 2 questions down here. And then if there are any questions online, we'll take those.
Thank you so much. Super interesting. My name is Fanny Ersgaard Madsen, also Roskilde University. So my question is about the whole industry of solar and wind energy. You talk about this as there are some possibilities there. But then I also looked into some research looking into the value chain of these industries that are quite concerning in terms of another side of the sustainability question, that is the social sustainability, where children are working in the mines, of course, as a geographical dimension, but also the social dimension. So how do you see the options regarding that? Does that require like a fourth revolution, or like Sune suggests a more like state-centric approach to it, where states invest and to sort of take out the whole creating surplus a profitable dimension of it to make it also socially sustainable? Yeah.
My name is Oscar Wood Hansen. We've talked a lot about climate policies and so state politics. What about the politics of workers? The climate movements in Europe, as I understand, not really worker-led. And I know this is a little bit beyond your expertise, but what about Arab politics? What about Chinese internal politics? Can we expect should we maybe forget this idea that the West, the bourgeois of the world, imperialist, will actually do something about this? Or should we maybe expect more, that there will be a strike from the people who are in the periphery? Or something else, another power there? Would you like to share some thoughts about that?
Dominic, were there any questions online? And while he's doing that, I'll just say 2 things. One is the seminar on May 11th, which is the last one, we actually have Elizabeth Thurbin, who has written a lot about China. So we will more specifically pick up China and her book, Developmental Environmentalism, but spin it and say, can there be such thing as a democratic environmentalism? So we'll also take up China again the next time. And then also, Fanny, on your question, we also, all the seminars will be available publicly after, and we had a lot of discussion about this topic on the last one with Henry Sanderson and Jojo Nim Singh, where we also looked at the mining and the mining processing. And a lot of these companies are Chinese, and so in his book, Volt Rush, Henry's book, he talks a lot about this, but what you'll see now is that in China, the Chinese government are forcing Chinese firms to clean up their act. But that doesn't apply to the Congo or to Chile or to elsewhere, so you also get these kind of contradiction emerging that these renewable energy value chains, yeah, where is the pressure coming from? And I asked whether or not Chinese firms are under pressure, because you don't have to have those social and environmental costs of mining. And so that's interesting, and you don't now in China because the state is forcing it, but then the states in those countries are not. So you get those kind of contradictions. But we discussed a lot about that, so when the videos are up, I encourage everyone to visit them. Andreas.
Okay, yeah. So much to discuss. I'm almost inclined to start from the last question. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because it hints at some kind of, you know, the Appel tradition, the Blekinge band theory updated for the climate crisis, that, okay, the revolutionary subject is in the periphery. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for a long time, I expected that what we would see, so maybe like, you know, when I started working on climate politics like 20 years ago, would be people in the global south developing a kind of a climate consciousness and becoming aware that when they're struck by disasters, this is because of fossil fuel production inflicted on them by the global north, and that you would see climate uprisings in the global south. But I think it's safe to say that that hasn't happened yet. And that what you're seeing is very much the opposite. In particular, and Sune, correct me if you think I'm saying wrong things here, because you know more about the Middle East than I do, but if you look at certain key countries in the Middle East that are suffering tremendously from climate disasters, you could point to Iraq or Iran. So Iraq is basically in a sustained crisis of chronic drought and excess heat, and is also threatened very badly by sea level rise in the south. And Iraq, of course, has been a center of the fossil economy for a century. So the agricultural sector in Iraq is going down, this being the, you know, the original breadbasket between the two rivers. And the way that Iraq tries to cope with this is to pump more oil. Because when the agricultural sector is disappearing, they have to import food and they have to get revenue somewhere else. And what can they sell in the market? Well, the one thing they have is oil. So they bank even more on oil production. So they're in this doom loop. I think the doom loop is really a key concept for contemporary climate politics. And you could point to, and there's been no sign of any kind of climate uprising in Iraq. Maybe for good reasons, because people have other things to, you know, on their mind. If you cross the border into Iran, it's in a way very similar. So as you might know, one of the ingredients that contributed to the uprising in January, which is a very complicated episode, was the extremely long-lasting and difficult drought in Iran that even, you know, pushed the president to openly consider having to relocate the entire capital, or, you know, move the population out. Extremely bad situation that ironically ended roughly at the same time as the war, just before it. Now, the way that crisis was dealt with in Iranian politics had very little connection to climate. So you have some very reactionary mullahs saying that this is God's punishment for our lax hijab enforcement. Similar to, you know, various conspiracy theories that pop up, you know, in Argentina, it was this idea that the wildfires is because the Israelis are here, and you know, and then of course, you know, it contributed to the general sense of social crisis because of the sanctions and everything that partly led to this eruption of popular dissent in January. But did it lead to any kind of questioning of the Iranian National Oil Company or the role of Iran in stoking the climate crisis, the role of fossil fuels in the Iranian social formation? No. So the cases that you can point to are mostly, again, in Latin America, because that's the one continent where the left, you know, at least until very recently, has had a continuing influence and an ability to you know, connect the dots discursively and actually even win elections. Now, Latin American politics, as I said, generally is drifting towards the right, but I don't think that we can bank on some kind of automatic emergence of a climate subject in the global south, unlike in the global north. It's as much of an uphill battle in a lot of the global south. Or take, Southeast, all the Gen Z protests that happened were again in countries badly affected by climate crisis. Indonesia, for instance. But is there anything like a climate uprising in Indonesia? I haven't seen it yet. It's very difficult to see that this is happening, and I had greater expectations on the formation of that kind of subjectivity a couple of decades ago. But yeah, it's a general crisis of political subjectivity in our moment. China versus the US. This is almost too big a question to address at this stage in time, and I should say, in 2 weeks, I'm supposed to give a lecture on this at what's it called, the Saxo Institute or something like that. Yeah. But I don't know what to say yet. I have thousands of tabs open on my computers that I've collected since the war started that I'm going to try to go through next week and say something meaningful about this. But it will be very, very superficial and amateurish what I have to say there, because I haven't, like I said, I haven't done any research on China. My current research is medieval environmental history, super nerdy, geeky stuff that has nothing to do with this. But I suspect that what we're seeing in the US, in the whole American empire, is another version of the doom loop, which is the following. This is just a hypothesis I'm throwing out. That this began. I mean, it began with the whole fracking boom and the return of the US to the forefront of oil and gas production, that the weight of the primitive fossil capital or the fossil fuel industry within American capitalism is growing. I mean, that capitalist class faction is becoming more and more powerful. And the Trump phenomenon in the last instance is an expression of that. I mean, you can't really understand the Trump phenomenon without deriving it from its base in oil and gas money. This is something we wrote about in White Skin, Black Fuel. Now, perversely, what you see, I think, is a loop where the aggressive American far right gets stronger because of the increasing weight of the fossil fuel industry, which is its material base. And this far right is then positioning itself as a nationalist and aggressive force, and engages in various kinds of imperial military adventures, like what we've seen recently, which in turn, with this war on Iran, raises the price further on oil and gas and makes these companies even more profitable and even more powerful, feeding in a kind of loop into even greater political strength for the Republican right within bourgeois politics in the U.S. Although, of course, in the polls they're plummeting, but who knows who will come after Donald Trump. And then you would have a loop, so, okay, even more powerful, regressive, far-right politicians on the Republican right with links to even more profitable fossil fuel companies starting new wars that will, and so on and so forth. And, I don't want to reduce what's happened over the past months to being only about oil and gas, but if you look at a list of what countries have the largest fossil fuel reserves in the world, you have Venezuela as 1, and you have Saudi Arabia as 2, and you have Iran as 3. That has some connection to what's happened over the past few months. And I think, it's pretty clear, it used to be difficult to make the case that wars are about oil because politicians would deny that it was about oil and wanting to take the oil, and you would be accused of being conspiracist or functionalist or whatever. But now you're just straight off positivist empiricist because you just read what they say. Stephen Miller and Donald Trump, they just explicitly say we are going to invade Venezuela to take the oil, and then they do exactly that. And it's quite clear that this is what they wanted to do with Iran as well. And here's where maybe what I can say substantially in my lecture in 2 weeks is that I think this explanation for what happened in Iran is all about the Israeli lobby is fundamentally flawed. This idea that this war happened just because Netanyahu wields such enormous influence over American politics that it distorts the empire. I think that's wrong. I think what we're seeing is a kind of hyper-fossil empire where Donald Trump is personifying and embodying the structural drive to take every drop of oil out of the ground and make maximum profit of it.
We have to close now, but I just want to. But do you think that's because renewable energy was finally becoming a threat? It was finally on the horizon as something real, and then this is the last hurrah of fossil capital?
Yeah, maybe. Do you think so?
I don't know.
I'm just thinking, but I'm combining as well because of what we were talking about. If we put this in a positive, if we can put in a positive, maybe this will push maybe some countries to go the other way, right? To say, okay, now enough is enough.
Yes.
And we go the other way.
Yes.
So let's hope that that's...
Yeah, this is the idea of, some kind of splintering between, and I think this is maybe what the comrade hinted at, some kind of China-supported electrostate sphere in the East, and then you have a Western Hemisphere. And another interesting, speaking of contradictions, is that the weight in the fossil fuel economy now seems to be pivoting towards Latin America, because with the shortfalls from the Gulf, you have Brazil and Argentina and Venezuela stepping up their production and doing it under a renewed American hegemony. So the kind of, there's a fossilization of the Americas vis-a-vis some kind of electrification of Asia potentially happening. I don't know. And some of that electrification, of course, coal power. But now I'm losing myself.
So unfortunately, we are out of time today, but hopefully we will pick up again on some of these issues on the last seminar on May 11th. So I just want you to join me in giving a hand to Andreas for making us to think in new and different ways. And thank you all for coming, also online.